A reclusive author encounters two young girls on the run, but as he tries to protect them, he uncovers devastating secrets that connect their stories in unimaginable ways. The past has never felt so present. Joe Reed had built a literary empire with his words, but for the past 2 years, they seemed to have abandoned him. After the tragic loss of his wife, the author retreated to a cabin in the mountains, where the silence was as deep as his loneliness. His works, once known for their emotional twists, were now just distant echoes of the man he used to be. Surrounded by towering mountains and endless snow, he faced a creative block as cold as the winter outside. Joe's cabin was a reflection of his soul, orderly, functional, yet devoid of life. Every corner bore Rachel's presence, whether in a forgotten photograph or the coffee cup he couldn't bear to put away. The money he'd earned from his books brought no comfort, and the title of Millionaire felt more like a burden than a blessing. Nothing consoled him anymore except the sound of the wind howling outside. The mornings were always the same: strong coffee, a frustrated attempt at writing, and a distant gaze toward the horizon. Joe's past haunted him like a ghost, dragging him back to memories of a time when he was more than just a broken man. He wondered if he would ever create something that could truly touch people again. But the only thing filling his days was emptiness. The nights, however, were worse. In the silence of darkness, he relived every moment of the accident that took Rachel away. Unanswered questions tormented him. What if I had done something differently? What if I had been there? These thoughts mixed with the lies he told himself just to keep going, lies that only pulled him deeper. And yet, Joe was a man who hid his pain behind a stoic facade. To the world, he was just an author seeking inspiration, not a widower searching for purpose. This duality kept him trapped in an endless cycle of attempts and failures, hope and despair. He avoided all contact with the outside world, convinced that his pain was best kept in isolation. But there was something unsettling about that quiet. It was as though the cabin itself was waiting for something, or someone, to pull him out of his apathy. Joe could feel it, though he couldn't understand it. There was a tension in the air, a promise of change, even if he refused to believe it. The phone, which rarely rang, was his only connection to the world beyond those mountains. Margot, his friend and editor, was persistent in her calls, begging him to deliver something new. But Joe always deflected, unable to admit that he had nothing to give. He knew Margot meant well, but her voice was a constant reminder of the man he no longer was. There were days when Joe considered abandoning writing altogether, selling the cabin, and disappearing. But then he would remember Rachel. She believed in his talent, in his ability to change lives with his stories. Even at his lowest, that memory kept him going. Perhaps it was the love he still felt for her, or the guilt of failing to honor her memory. Joe didn't know it yet, but something was about to happen. Something that would challenge everything he believed about himself and the world. An encounter that would shatter the monotony of his life and set him on a path of twists and turns he could never have imagined. The snow outside seemed thicker that morning, almost as if it were hiding something. And when he opened the door to a white, silent world, Joe had no idea that his solitude was about to be interrupted in a way he could never undo. Joe expected nothing but silence that morning. The sound of the wind battering against the windows was his only company, until a faint noise cut through the snowy landscape. A scream. He hesitated, thinking it might be his mind playing tricks on him, but the sound came again, louder this time. Something within him, an instinct long buried, urged him to move. He pulled on his coat, laced up his boots, and stepped into the biting cold. Not far from the cabin, Joe found two small figures, nearly swallowed by the snow. Claire, with her wary, defiant eyes, clutched Hannah, who trembled from cold and fear. Both were lost, desperate, clearly running from something. He didn't need to ask questions to sense the urgency in their gaze. With a quick nod, he offered shelter without thinking about the consequences. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried the promise of irreversible change. Back in the cabin, Joe did his best to warm the girls and offer them food. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. He noticed Claire's quick, calculating glances, as if measuring whether she could trust him. Hannah, the younger of the two, seemed to find some relief in the safety of the place. Yet there was something unsettling about the way they both flinched at any sound coming from outside. Joe tried to speak to them, but their answers were short, evasive. The girls were clearly afraid to reveal anything, but whatever it was written on their faces. Still, something about them moved him deeply. He couldn't help but notice how Claire's defiant gaze masked a vulnerability that reminded him of his own youth. That night, as the girls slept on the couch in the living room, Joe remained awake, watching them from a distance. He didn't understand why he had decided to get involved, but something in their desperation made him want to protect what he hardly even knew. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of purpose, even if it was wrapped in uncertainty. The next morning, Hannah woke up crying. Between sobs, she uttered a sentence that pierced Joe's heart. "They're going to find us?" He tried to comfort her, but Claire's expression said it all. They were running from something or someone. Joe didn't want to push them, but he needed to know more if he was to decide what to do next. Even without clear answers, Joe couldn't ignore the situation. Something about the way they clung to each other reminded him of Rachel, that same look of someone seeking shelter from a storm, whether it was literal or emotional. The memories he had buried began to surface, unsettling him even further. As Joe struggled to decide what to do, the snow outside kept falling, almost like a protective blanket. But he knew it wouldn't last forever. The world beyond was dangerous, and whatever the girls were running from would soon find its way to his door. He had to act, even if he didn't know how or where to begin. Reluctantly, Joe began to consider reaching out for help. But who could he turn to? The only person who came to mind was Margot, his editor. He knew she would insist that he get back to life, but he felt he had to take a step forward, even with the weight of his past still pressing on his shoulders. As the girls curled up on the sofa, Joe stared out the window, lost in thought. He didn't know exactly what he was doing, but one thing was clear: that day marked the beginning of something he could no longer avoid. The world as he knew it was about to change forever. Joe felt like a stranger in his own life. As he looked at Claire and Hannah, sitting on the living room couch, the weight of his choice began to press down on him. He wasn't a father, nor a protector. What did he know about taking care of teenagers? Especially two girls who so clearly carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. The cabin, once his refuge, now felt too small for so much silence and so many secrets. While making coffee, he heard Claire's voice for the first time. She was asking how long they could stay there. The question hit him like a blow. He didn't have an answer, but he knew he couldn't keep them there forever. They needed professional help, someone who knew what they were doing. Surely, this wasn't for him, a broken man with more past than future. Joe tried to rationalize it. He was just a writer. His specialty was creating twists on the page, not dealing with real-world problems. Sitting in the armchair by the fireplace, he wondered what to do while the soft sound of the girls whispering to each other filled the room. Something about their voices tugged at a part of him he didn't want to acknowledge: empathy. That night, Joe found himself staring at a photo of Rachel. He missed her so deeply it was overwhelming, but he also carried the guilt of never having had children. That emptiness had become an abyss within him. Rachel had always been the brave one, the one who believed in the power of small actions. He, on the other hand, preferred to hide behind his words, avoiding risks. As he reflected, Hannah appeared at the living room door, clutching a blanket like it was a shield. "Thank you for helping us," she murmured with a disarming sweetness. Joe just nodded, unable to respond. He knew he needed to do something more, but he couldn't convince himself that he was the right person for it. The next day, Joe decided to call Margot. He needed an external opinion, someone who could help him see things clearly. But Margot was relentless. "You can't just hand them off to someone else and go back to your life," she said, with a firmness he didn't expect. Her words echoed in his mind long after he hung up. Even so, Joe remained torn. On one hand, he wanted to believe he could help, but on the other, the idea of failing the girls paralyzed him. He wasn't sure he had the strength to deal with this, especially when he was still wrestling with his own demons. The pain of losing Rachel was a constant reminder of his limitations. Joe began searching for excuses to avoid getting more involved. Maybe the girls had family who could be contacted. Maybe it would be better to call the authorities and let them handle the case. But deep down, he knew he was trying to run away. The responsibility of caring for them felt too heavy for him to bear. As these doubts consumed him, a conversation between Claire and Hannah made him stop. "He's not going to want to keep us," Claire whispered, her sadness almost tangible. Hannah replied with something Joe couldn't hear, but it was enough to unsettle him. He didn't want to be another person who abandoned them, but how could he promise something he wasn't sure he could fulfill? And so, Joe's refusal became an internal dilemma. He knew he was in the middle of something far bigger than he'd imagined, but the thought of failing as a protector was terrifying. He needed a push, something to drag him out of his indecision. And when Margot mentioned a specific person who could help him, he began to consider that maybe he didn't have to face this alone. Joe hesitated before picking up the phone again. Margot had insisted, "Call Mary, she's a social worker, she knows how to handle situations like this." The name sounded distant, almost cold, but he knew he needed help. Caught between resistance and guilt, he dialed the number. The voice on the other end was firm yet warm, as though she was used to dealing with emergencies. Without realizing it, Joe found himself pouring everything out, about the girls, the cold, their terrified expressions, and even the emptiness he felt. Mary arrived late that afternoon. She was young, but her demeanor exuded experience and authority. Her warm smile contrasted with the sharp, observant gaze that took in every detail. At first, Claire and Hannah remained defensive, but there was something about the way Mary spoke, with a balance of firmness and empathy, that began to break down their walls. Joe, on the other hand, felt uncomfortable, as though he was revealing more of himself than he ever intended. As they talked, Mary didn't take long to point out something Joe had been avoiding. "You didn't find them by accident. Maybe they need you as much as you need them." The words reverberated in his mind. It was as if she had seen something in him that he couldn't see himself. He tried to brush it off, but Mary just smiled. A knowing smile, the kind that comes when someone has planted a seed. Margot continued to be present, even from afar. Her persistent messages were a mix of advice and emotional nudges. "You write about heroes all the time, Joe. Isn't it time you became one?" The provocation irritated him, but she had a point. He had always known how to create strong, resilient characters filled with twists and turns, but now life was demanding that he become one himself. Mary spent more time with the girls than with Joe that day. She understood that earning their trust had to be the priority. Meanwhile, Joe watched from a distance, feeling a mix of relief and inadequacy. He realized that Mary had something he had lost over the years, the belief that, even in the darkest situations, there was always a way out. Before leaving, Mary approached Joe. "They don't trust many people, but it's obvious they already see something in you. Don't let them down." He wanted to protest, to explain that he wasn't prepared for this, but her words disarmed him. There was a weight to this responsibility that he didn't know how to carry, but there was also a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. In the days that followed, Margot kept pushing. She knew Joe needed a support network just as much as the girls did. "Trust Mary. She's good at what she does, but you have to be willing to work with her." Despite all his doubts, Joe felt that, for the first time, he had allies who truly cared. Still, the fear of failure lingered in his mind like a constant shadow. Claire, with her usual distrust, tested Joe and Mary's limits. Yet there were moments when her guard dropped, and she allowed herself to breathe. Hannah, younger and more sensitive, began to open up little by little, especially to Mary. These small breakthroughs showed Joe that perhaps, just perhaps, he was on the right path. But nothing was simple. Joe knew that Mary couldn't stay forever, and Margot, for all her support, had her own boundaries. He would have to decide how far he was willing to go. And as Mary explained what needed to be done to protect the girls, Joe realized that, somehow, he was already in this up to his neck. At the end of the visit, Mary looked at Joe with a mixture of understanding and expectation. The girls need someone to see them for who they are, not as a problem to be solved. "That could be you, Joe, if you want it to be." Her words lingered as she left, leaving the cabin in a silence that felt heavier than before. Joe knew the decision was in his hands, but the doubts still weighed on him. The next morning, Joe woke to the muffled sound of laughter coming from the living room. Claire and Hannah were sitting on the floor, playing with the old board game he and Rachel used to pull out during stormy days. The scene caught him off guard. For a brief moment, the cabin felt alive again, as if that small act had restored something he didn't even know he missed. But at the same time, the reality of the situation came crashing back down on him. He needed to make a decision. As he sipped his coffee, Mary arrived with a stack of documents and a determined expression. "If you really want to help them, this goes beyond offering shelter," she said, placing the papers on the table. "These girls are in real danger. We need to protect them." Joe knew she was right, but the commitment implied in those words made him hesitate. Being a protector meant far more than he felt ready for. Claire, ever observant, noticed the tension on Joe's face. "You're going to send us away, aren't you?" The question came like a knife, sharp and cutting. He tried to assure her that wouldn't happen, but the lack of conviction in his voice didn't escape her. Claire crossed her arms, her gaze a mix of defiance and despair. It was clear she wasn't used to trusting anyone. Joe's journey to accepting the role of protector wasn't a leap but a slow, painful process. Mary guided him, explaining the steps that needed to be taken to ensure the girls' safety. Yet, every decision felt like an additional weight. He found himself reliving his own childhood, full of uncertainties and loneliness, and that made him even more reluctant. Hannah, on the other hand, seemed to begin seeing Joe as a safe harbor. She followed him around the cabin, asking simple yet loaded questions. "Were you ever afraid of the dark?" she asked one day. Joe laughed, but he realized she was serious. He answered honestly, "Yes, and sometimes I still am." It was the first time he felt he was truly connecting with them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, as if the world had frozen in that moment. Mary insisted that they needed to act quickly before the girls' adoptive parents tried to track them down. But Joe still wrestled with the idea of getting involved in something so much bigger than himself. He knew he couldn't simply send them back to a system that had already failed them. As he read the reports about the adoptive couple, accounts of abuse and neglect that made his stomach turn, something shifted inside him. He couldn't ignore what he now knew. The thought of sending the girls back to that environment filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in years. It was as if, finally, a fire had been lit within him. Claire, still guarded, began challenging Joe in other ways. "Why do you even care? You don't know us." The question took him by surprise, but he knew the answer. "Because no one cared about me when I was a kid," he admitted. The silence that followed was heavy but full of understanding. It was the first time he publicly acknowledged the connection he felt with them. Mary was direct. If Joe wanted to protect the girls, he would have to take on legal and emotional responsibilities far beyond anything he had faced before. "This isn't going to be easy," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "But they need you, Joe. And, frankly, I think you need them too." He knew she was right, even if the thought terrified him. That night, as he watched the two girls sleeping on the sofa, Joe felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He still didn't know how he would do it, but he had made a decision. He would protect Claire and Hannah, no matter the cost. With that resolve, he crossed the first threshold, stepping into unknown territory, but one that was undeniably necessary. The following days brought a new rhythm to the cabin. Claire, with her combative demeanor, frequently tested Joe's limits. "You're going to leave us like everyone else, aren't you?" she said during dinner, her voice dripping with resentment. Joe didn't respond immediately. He knew that, for her, words mattered as much as actions. He simply kept serving more soup as if to say that, for now, they were safe here. Hannah, more reserved, showed her trust in subtler ways. One day, she brought Joe a drawing, a snow-covered cabin with 3 figures holding hands beside it. He held the paper for a moment, feeling something warm stir in his chest. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a plea for safety, for permanence. Somehow, he knew he needed to answer that call. Meanwhile, Mary remained a constant presence. She checked in daily, updating Joe on the next steps and potential complications. "The adoptive couple has hired a lawyer," she said one night. "They want the girls back, and they have enough money to make this complicated." The mention of his adversary's financial power made Joe shiver. He knew he was up against more than just emotional battles. Margot's arrival at the cabin brought a much-needed sense of relief. With her pragmatic energy, she immediately took on the role of strategist. "Joe, you have more resources than you realize. If they have money, we have the truth. And I know a few journalists who would love to hear this story." Her determination sparked a newfound confidence in Joe, even though he hesitated to expose the girl's ordeal publicly. Still, the challenges kept coming. Joe began to realize that the fight wasn't just against the adoptive couple, it was also against himself. A voice inside him whispered doubts, questioning his ability to be a protector. In moments when Claire challenged him or Hannah withdrew, that voice seemed to grow louder. Unexpected allies began to emerge, however. Ben, a local mechanic, offered help after hearing rumors about the girls. "I know that couple," Ben said, his tone dark. "They shouldn't be taking care of a dog, let alone children." It was an unanticipated source of support, but it reassured Joe that he wasn't entirely alone. Among allies and adversaries, there were also moments of light. Claire, despite her resistance, began to let her guard down. One evening, she confided in Joe about how she used to read in secret, using a flashlight under the covers because her adoptive parents didn't think she needed books. It was a glimpse of who she was before pain had shaped her. Joe silently vowed she would never have to hide herself again. The nights in the cabin started transforming into small havens of normalcy. Joe read to Hannah while Claire pretended not to care, though her curious eyes betrayed her feigned indifference. Each small act built a connection, even if he didn't have all the answers yet. There was progress, but the constant fear that it could all collapse lingered. Tensions reached a boiling point when a letter arrived at the cabin, demanding that the girls be immediately returned to the adoptive couple. The legal threat was explicit, and Joe knew he would have to prepare for a battle far greater than he had anticipated. But he also knew giving up wasn't an option. It wasn't just about protecting Claire and Hannah, it was about proving to them that they deserved better. Now surrounded by allies like Margot, Mary, and even Ben, Joe felt more supported. Still, the road ahead was fraught with uncertainties. He didn't know how he would win, but he knew exactly who he was fighting for. With Claire and Hannah gradually placing their trust in him, Joe felt he wasn't just protecting them, he was rediscovering himself in the process. Joe knew he couldn't face this battle with determination alone. He needed information. With Mary and Margot's help, he began to dig into Claire and Hannah's past. Each discovery felt like opening an old wound. The adoption system reports were grim, filled with negligence and failures. But there was something else, something buried that no one seemed willing to talk about. The investigation led him to a small neighboring town, where he found a former employee of the orphanage where the girls had once lived. The woman, hesitant at first, eventually revealed details that left him speechless. "The adoptive couple has influence in this town," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "But those girls, they should never have been sent to that house." Joe felt the weight of her words but knew he had to dig deeper. Margot, ever pragmatic, uncovered a crucial lead, documents mentioning the girls' biological parents. What began as a quest for justice turned into something much more personal. Joe discovered that their parents had a direct connection to his late brother, a link he could never have anticipated. It was as though the past was converging on him, forcing him to confront not only the girls' shadows but also his own. As Joe processed these revelations, Claire began to open up hesitantly. She shared memories of the moments before they were taken into the system. The shouting, the broken promises, the desperate attempts to protect Hannah, even as a child herself. Her voice carried a premature maturity that broke Joe's heart. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply listened, allowing her to unload the weight she had been carrying. In the midst of this emotional storm, Mary remained a steady anchor. "You're more connected to them than you realize," she told him one day, as they sifted through the newly uncovered documents. Maybe this happened for a reason. Joe wanted to reject the idea but couldn't. There was something in her calm confidence that made him believe he could be part of the solution. Tensions escalated when the adoptive couple attempted to contact Joe directly. The call came late at night, full of veiled threats and insinuations about what might happen if he continued to interfere. Joe hung up, but their words lingered, echoing in his mind. He knew they wouldn't give up easily, and that only strengthened his resolve. Even amidst the heavy revelations, Joe found small moments of relief. Hannah, with her innocence, continued to bring light to his days. One afternoon, she handed him another drawing, this time of a mountain with the sun shining brightly above it. "It's us climbing," she explained, as if it were obvious. The simplicity of it touched him in a way he hadn't expected. Claire, though more resistant, began to change as well. She surprised him by asking for a book to read, something she had never done before. "I used to like this," she admitted, almost shyly. Joe not only gave her one of his favorite books but also started discussing the story with her, creating a space for dialogue that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. As Joe delved deeper into the past, the ghosts of his own life began to resurface. He remembered the brother he had lost, the fights, the moments they drifted apart out of pride. There was an old pain there, one he had never confronted. And now, watching the girls struggle with the shadows of their own pasts, he realized that perhaps he was finally ready to face his. With each step, Joe moved closer to the truth, but also to something deeper, the realization that in saving the girls, he might find his own redemption. The past was there, staring him in the face, and he knew he couldn't keep running from it. The next step wouldn't just be about them, it would be about him too. The silence in the room felt heavier than ever. Joe held the envelope containing the adoptive couple's formal custody request in his hands. The language was cold, threatening, as if every word had been carefully chosen to intimidate him. He knew this was only the beginning of a legal battle that would demand more from him than he believed he was capable of giving. Claire, ever perceptive, found Joe sitting at the table, his gaze distant. "Are they going to take us back?" she asked, her voice trembling but defiant. He saw the fear in her eyes, a fear she tried to mask with a brave front. Joe shook his head slowly. "I won't let that happen," he promised, though he had no idea how he would keep that promise. Mary arrived shortly after, carrying a stack of documents and a plan. "This is going to be hard, Joe. They have resources, connections. But we have something they don't, the truth." She laid out the next steps, from gathering testimonies to compiling evidence. The road ahead seemed insurmountable, but her confidence was infectious. With her by his side, Joe felt there might be a chance. The following days were a mix of tension and hope. Joe worked tirelessly to gather all the necessary information, diving into reports, testimonies, and even painful memories he had long tried to bury. Each new piece of evidence was a small victory but also a reminder of how precarious his position was. He knew the system was flawed and that justice didn't always mean triumph. Meanwhile, Claire and Hannah were fighting their own emotional battles. Claire, always the protector, tried to stay strong for Hannah, but Joe could see the cracks in her armor. She had nightmares almost every night, waking up breathless and terrified. Hannah, on the other hand, clung to Joe like a beacon, seeking safety in his presence. He felt torn between the weight of responsibility and the overwhelming desire to shield them at any cost. The confrontation with the adoptive couple was inevitable. During a preliminary hearing, Joe saw them for the first time, well-dressed, polished individuals with an unsettling coldness in their eyes. They spoke with authority, insinuating that Joe was just an outsider meddling in something he didn't understand. What unsettled him most, however, was the condescending smile they directed at Claire and Hannah. During the girls' testimony, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. Claire, with her steady voice, recounted stories of neglect and abuse that brought Joe to the brink of tears. Hannah, still shy, confirmed everything with just a few words, though her gaze said more than any sentence could. Despite their youth, Joe realized these girls possessed a courage he could only admire. Joe's emotional battle was no less intense. He was questioned about his intentions, his ability to care for the girls, and even his own past. Each question felt like an attempt to unearth him, to expose his weaknesses. Yet, with each response, he felt a growing strength, as though he was fighting not just for them, but also for himself. The final decision came after hours of agonizing waiting. Joe knew he had done everything he could, but the uncertainty was crushing. When the judge finally announced the verdict, he could barely breathe. The court had ruled in Joe's favor, granting him temporary custody of Claire and Hannah. Relief and disbelief washed over him, as though he were waking from a nightmare. That night, back at the cabin, Claire surprised Joe with a sudden hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Joe held back tears, feeling for the first time that he had done something truly meaningful. But he also knew this was only the beginning. The fight to rebuild their lives, both theirs and his, was just starting. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't the emptiness of before, but a quiet filled with meaning. Claire and Hannah were no longer temporary guests, but part of a home Joe was beginning to build. For the first time in years, he felt that this once lonely space now overflowed with something he hadn't realized he needed: life. The girls started adjusting to their new routine. Claire, still cautious, found solace in reading. Joe surprised her with a stack of books he'd kept since his youth, and she devoured them as if discovering a whole new world. Hannah, on the other hand, seemed more at ease, filling the days with laughter and drawings. Each of their small interactions reminded Joe that he had made the right choice. Mary remained a constant presence, though her role had shifted. She was no longer just a social worker but a friend and confidant. Her visits became less formal, often accompanied by homemade cookies or ideas for activities to help the girls feel more secure. There was a lightness in her smile that began to disarm Joe, something he wasn't sure he was ready to embrace. Margot, as always, was practical and direct. "You have an incredible story in your hands, Joe. But before you write it, you need to live it." He didn't fully understand what she meant, but he was beginning to see that the true reward of this journey wasn't something he could capture in words. It was something deeper, more lasting. One evening, as Hannah slept on the couch and Claire was engrossed in a book, Joe sat at the wooden table with a blank notebook. For the first time in years, he felt the urge to write. But instead of creating characters or plotting twists, he began to put down what he was living. Each word seemed to lift a weight off his shoulders, as if he were piecing back together parts of himself he thought he'd lost. The girls were starting to put down roots too. Claire asked to decorate the small room she shared with Hannah, and together they chose colors and decorations. Joe, though awkward, helped them paint the walls. It was a simple gesture, but it symbolized something greater. They finally had a place where they felt they belonged. On a quiet afternoon, Joe took the girls into town, something he rarely did. It was a small outing but meant a lot. Hannah insisted on buying a sketchbook, and Claire chose a star-shaped bookmark. As they returned to the cabin, laughing at a joke Joe barely understood, he realized he was beginning to find happiness in things that had once seemed insignificant. During one of her visits, Mary made an observation that stuck with Joe. "You didn't just save them, Joe. They saved you too." He knew she was right. The girls had brought something back into his life, something he thought he'd lost forever with Rachel. More than that, they had helped him see that he was still capable of loving and being loved. Claire, who had kept an emotional distance, surprised Joe by calling him Dad for the first time. It was a brief, almost casual moment, but it was loaded with meaning. He didn't respond right away, feeling a lump form in his throat. But deep down, he knew he was on the right path. He didn't need to be perfect, he just needed to be present. Joe's reward wasn't something he could measure. It wasn't about money or recognition, but the transformation happening within him. He had started this journey as a broken man, unable to see beyond his own pain. Now, he was building something that transcended his losses, something that gave him a new purpose, being the family that Claire and Hannah deserved. The cabin in the mountains, once a refuge of solitude, now felt alive. The days of endless silence had given way to laughter, conversations, and the sound of little footsteps running back and forth. For the first time in years, Joe realized his life had rhythm again. Claire and Hannah weren't just adjusting to their new home, they were helping to transform it. Joe began to regain his writing routine, but with an entirely different approach. Now, his inspiration came from the little things: Hannah's laughter while she drew, the way Claire furrowed her brow while losing herself in a book, the warmth of human connection that now filled the cabin. He wasn't just creating stories, he was documenting a new chapter in his life. Margot, ever direct, wasted no time encouraging him. "If this doesn't bring you back to creative life, nothing will," she joked, while reviewing the first pages of a new manuscript. The tone was different, more human, more personal. Joe was learning that, sometimes, the best stories are born from one's own experiences. The girls were also discovering their own routines. Hannah spent hours drawing, her creativity flourishing in a safe environment. Claire, on the other hand, developed an interest in writing, often asking Joe for feedback on her stories. "Is it good?" she would ask, trying to hide the anxiety in her voice. Joe always responded honestly, "It's great. But the most important thing is that you're telling your truth." Mary remained a regular presence, though her visits were now less about guidance and more about connection. Joe found himself enjoying her company in a way that scared him. She was kind but firm, empathetic yet determined. He began to see something in her that he hadn't seen in anyone since Rachel, a possibility. As they settled into their new lives, Joe decided to take the girls on a trip to the town where they had grown up. It was a risky step, but a necessary one. Claire wanted to visit the library where she used to hide, and Hannah asked to see the park where she played as a child. It was an experience filled with conflicting emotions, but one that helped close some old wounds. Joe also started reconnecting with the outside world. The local community, which once viewed him as a recluse, now saw him as a dedicated father. He received unexpected support from neighbors and even strangers who admired his courage in taking on such responsibility. It was as if, by helping Claire and Hannah find their place in the world, he was also finding his own. However, the journey back wasn't without challenges. Joe still faced moments of doubt, especially when he saw the girls struggling with their own scars. There were days when Claire would withdraw or Hannah would have nightmares, and he didn't always know how to help. But instead of running away, he learned to stay present, to listen, and to offer comfort in the best way he could. Margot, ever pragmatic, made an observation that stuck with him. "You thought you were saving them, but the truth is, they're saving you too." Joe knew this was true. Each small step the girls took forward mirrored his own growth. He was learning to be vulnerable again, to accept that life didn't need to be perfect to be good. At the end of each day, as he watched Claire and Hannah sleep peacefully, Joe felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He understood that the path to healing was a long one, but he also knew he was on the right track. His journey had brought him back to the world, but now he was no longer alone. He had a new family, and a new reason to believe in the future. The cabin, once merely a physical shelter, had now become a home. Joe recognized the transformation in small gestures. Hannah's unexpected laughter, Claire's protective manner as she helped him in the kitchen, and the nights they gathered around the fireplace to share stories. It was as if each moment confirmed that he was truly beginning a new chapter in his life. Still, the ghosts of the past lingered. Some nights, when everything was quiet, he felt Rachel's absence pressing down on him, a shadow he couldn't ignore. But now, that pain didn't consume him. He was beginning to understand that the love he still held for her didn't have to be an obstacle to this new chapter. It could instead be part of the foundation for what he was building. Claire was changing too. Her initial distrust had been replaced by a touching maturity, a strength Joe deeply admired. She began calling him Dad more naturally, though always with that cautious tone that revealed the scars of her past. Each time she said the word, it was as if Joe was being reborn, rediscovering pieces of himself he thought had been lost forever. Hannah, on the other hand, was thriving. She drew endlessly, filling the cabin with colorful images that reflected her newfound perspective on life. One day, she handed Joe a drawing, a tree with deep roots and branches reaching toward the sky. "It's us," she said with disarming simplicity. Joe felt his eyes well up. He was becoming the foundation they needed, and at the same time, they were helping him grow. Mary remained a constant presence, but now her relationship with Joe had grown into something more than just an alliance for the girls. They shared long, meaningful conversations, filled with laughter and, at times, comfortable silences. There was something happening between them, something Joe didn't want to rush but couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the warmth of a connection beyond friendship. Margot, true to form, continued to be his biggest cheerleader. "You're writing again, you're raising two incredible girls, and you've got someone by your side who clearly cares about you," she said in a phone call. If this isn't a fresh start, I don't know what is. Joe smiled, recognizing that despite the challenges, he was living something he never thought possible, a second chance. Despite the progress, Joe still had fears. He worried about failing Claire and Hannah, worried about not being enough. But instead of letting those fears paralyze him, he used them as motivation. Every decision he made was a step forward, not just to protect the girls, but to prove to himself that he could be the man they needed. The community around him began to notice the change. The man once known as a recluse was now seen as a dedicated father and an inspiring figure. He received support from people he never expected, reinforcing his determination to keep fighting, not just for the girls, but for himself as well. Joe realized that while he was battling the system to protect Claire and Hannah, he was also confronting something within himself. Every victory, every moment of connection with them, was a way of healing wounds he had carried for so long. He wasn't just becoming a father, he was becoming a better version of himself. That night, as Claire and Hannah slept peacefully, Joe sat at the table with Mary. They shared a glass of wine and a smile that spoke volumes without words. He realized that the resurrection he so desperately needed wasn't just in the girls or his writing, it was also in opening his heart to love and the possibility of a full, meaningful future. Joe woke that morning with a different feeling, a calm he hadn't experienced in years. The cabin, now full of life, seemed to hum with energy. Claire and Hannah were in the kitchen, laughing over something silly, and Mary, with her steady presence, was making coffee. Joe stood there for a moment, watching, overwhelmed with gratitude for everything that had changed in his life. The days of solitude and creative block felt like a distant memory. Joe had not only returned to writing but also found inspiration in the journey he had shared with Claire and Hannah. His new manuscript, which he called A House in the Snow, was more than just a story, it was a testament to love, resilience, and transformation. He knew he was crafting the most important work of his career. Claire, now more confident, began talking about her dreams. "I want to be a lawyer and help people the way you helped us," she said one day, with the determined tone Joe had come to admire. Hannah, meanwhile, was already planning to become an illustrator. "I'll draw all your books," she said with the same sweetness that always brightened the room. Mary was by Joe's side every step of this new chapter. Their relationship blossomed naturally, without haste. She supported him through his doubts, encouraged him in moments of uncertainty, and most importantly, made him believe he deserved this second chance. Their connection wasn't just romantic, it was a true and solid partnership. The community around the cabin began noticing the impact Joe was having, not just on the girls but on the town itself. Neighbors and friends started seeking him out to hear his story, and he became an example of how life could be rebuilt, even under the toughest circumstances. He hadn't expected to inspire anyone, but he embraced the role with humility. There was a moment Joe would always treasure, the night Claire and Hannah convinced him to decorate the cabin for Christmas. As they hung lights and adorned an improvised tree, he realized how far they had come. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation, now glowed with the promise of new beginnings. Margot, after reading the first chapters of Joe's new book, was deeply moved. "This isn't just a story, Joe. It's your redemption," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. He knew she was right. The book was more than just words on a page. It was proof that he had faced his demons and found something worth fighting for. Claire, Hannah, and Mary had become more than just companions. They were his family. Joe finally understood that love didn't replace losses. It expanded the heart to hold more. He would never forget Rachel, but he knew she would be proud of how he had chosen to move forward, of how he had found the strength to create something beautiful from the pain. Joe felt like he had returned to the world, but not as the same man he once was. He was more whole, more aware of the value in every moment. He had learned that hardships weren't just burdens, they were opportunities to grow and connect. The cabin, once a symbol of seclusion, was now a home filled with love, laughter, and dreams. On the final night of the year, as the fire crackled in the fireplace, Joe looked at Claire, Hannah, and Mary, feeling a peace he never thought possible. He had a new story to tell, but more importantly, he had a new life to live. The elixir he carried now was the love he had found and the certainty that, No matter how hard the journey, there was always light at the end.